Today's speaker, Dr. Susan Macmanus, is a professor at the University of South Florida and is Florida's most quoted political scientist. She is not affiliated with either party. We convinced Dr. Macmanus to join us after listening to her talk about Florida's steamy politics on National Public Radio. Since 1998, she has served as a political analyst for Tampa's NBC affiliate, WFLA Channel 8. Since 2008, she has been a featured columnist on SapphireReview.com, a widely read Florida-based political website. She has appeared on every major broadcast and radio network and has been interviewed by major newspapers in Florida, the U.S., and abroad. Dr. Macmanus served as chair of the Florida Elections Commission from 1999 to 2003 and helped the Collins Center for Public Policy draft Florida's Help America Vote Act state plan required by Congress to qualify for federal funding under the Help America Vote Act. She was a Fulbright Scholar at Yonsei University in Seoul, Korea in 1989 and received the University of South Florida's Distinguished Research Scholar Award in 1991. Please join me now in welcoming Dr. Susan Macmanus.
Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here, and let's just get one thing straight. I don't know who's going to win the governor's race, and neither do you. Well, we got a few months here, and a few weeks, I guess, to get going, but it's really a pleasure to be here today. I applaud the students and their professors for coming, and I would be remiss if I didn't tell you that the professor who's responsible for where I am today, my former major professor from FSU, is here as a guest of the forum, and his wife. So, thank you. Well, let's get going here. Let's take a look at this crazy election that we've got going on here. And one of the things as a political scientist you have to learn to do is to put things in context. And we have a governor's race that's plopped down in the middle of a pretty long period of a cynical and angry mood among the Florida electorate and the national electorate. So we look at this thing called the direction of the country, and you'll see here from this graphic that the mood of Americans has been pretty sour for quite some time before we had this highly negative governor's race be put right in the middle of it. And the same thing here, if you look at the president's job approval, Americans are a little bit negative about that as well. But to me, the big story is this slide, which is Congress. At one point this year, they actually they were at 8% approval rating of the public. And we can laugh about this, but for the average person that kind of tunes in and out of politics, their imagery of politics is based on what they see in Washington, and they don't like what they see at all. In fact, there's some really pretty funny slides and polls that have been done here when you ask people, who would do a better job, whether picking somebody from the phone book or not. It's pretty compelling, I'd say. And then, of course, if you keep going here and you ask, and this is a serious thing because it's an indictment not only of our elected officials but also our party system to a certain extent, when you ask people if the people in Congress are really the party of the people or not, and you see the answer to that. But moving along here, this is a longer trend line. This is done through the National Election Studies, and they look at tracking of how people feel about the two major parties. And there's a pretty much of a downward slope here too, and it's particularly if you really peel off all of it, trust in the two parties is really eroding quickly among the millennials, which is our newest younger group. We have millennials in the back here. So then if you look at, again, opinion, and I want to apologize to all the good elected officials in this room here, but you have to, again, put it in a bigger picture, and it's not particularly a nice one. When you look at the two professions that people have the least trust in as far as ethical behavior these days, and the top of the list are the two groups that are most a key part of our election system, which of course is journalists and politicians. Now, thankfully, you'll notice educators are still pretty okay, so I'm glad for that one. Moving along, though, we have a huge question in politics today. We call it the M&M question, and it really isn't too sweet. When you ask people what they think is the bigger problem in politics, is it money or is it the media? Pretty close divide, but a little bit of an edge to the media. So again, these are things that are troubling to people who are trying to think about voting in our upcoming election, not only here, but across the country. Now, I know probably you can't see this slide, but I had to put it in here. This was a study done by the Harvard School of Public Health on stress in America. And it was a serious question. They were asking what things in people's life you find the most stressful. And the top one here, of course, is pretty understandable, family scheduling and all that. But look at number 2, hearing about the government or politicians, what they're doing. And number 3, watching, reading, or listening to the news. So again, I've seen now negativity in our legislative, executive branches. I see negativity towards our institution, the media. And it's spilling over into one of the nastiest races we've seen in a long time in Florida, this governor's race. So lest you forget about how close Florida has been for the last few election cycles, let me remind you that in the 2010 governor's race, the closest in Florida history, just 1.2% difference between Oct.6 and the Governor Scott. But look at the presidential race, which we probably moved on after that, didn't look at. It was 0.9% difference. That was all that differentiated between President Obama and Governor Romney in this state. So it's no surprise that we have this kind of dead heat situation that we've got in our state right now heading into the governor's race. But I thought for many of you that haven't looked at the registration figures lately, these are the latest ones. We just ran these numbers and created some graphs for you. Gender, women make up around 53% of Florida's voters. Women rule, of course, we know that, but moving along. Race and ethnicity, there's some really interesting things on this graphic because now for about the second or third election, in terms of registration, Hispanics have outnumbered African Americans in our state. But one of the evening things is that turnout tends to be higher among blacks than it is Hispanics. But it's no surprise that both with the growing trend line for Hispanics in our state, no surprise that each of our gubernatorial candidates has selected a Hispanic as a running mate. One chose a Colombian, the other a Cuban, and you have there some interesting dynamics in South Florida that most of you are very familiar with. The rise in our state of country of origin identity politics is spilling over into the governor's race. We've already seen a lot of it in local politics in this area. But many people, when I go out and I speak to groups outside of Florida, there's 2 things that they always have these myths or stereotypes about our state that just aren't true. And one of them is that every Hispanic in our state is a Cuban, and they're all Republicans. Well, we know that's not true on either front. This was something taken from the 2012 presidential election exit poll done by a Miami polling firm. And you can see here that Cubans in the 2012 election were 1/3 of the electorate. But you see the rise of the Puerto Rican and South American other countries of origin. The Puerto Rican vote is really increasingly huge in the I-4 corridor area, and particularly Orlando and even in Tampa. Cuban for years were the dominant ethnic group there, but now Puerto Ricans are even the largest Hispanic group in Hillsborough County, which is Tampa. So moving along here, in terms of age, here's the second myth. Again, when I go out and speak, everybody's convinced in Florida that everyone here is 95 years of age or older. Now, I imagine most of us hope we get there, but the bottom line is this is probably one of the most interesting slides in all that we're going to look at, because when you really add up the 2 groups, under and over 50, it's 52% over 50 and 48% under. A very divided Florida age-wise, something that many, many people have really not caught up with. And if you look at the groups here, really, the plurality group is the 30 to 49-year-olds. And right now, they're one of the groups that you see kind of fluctuating in the polls from one week or one day to the next, depending on what we've got going on. And then when you look at party, again, another myth, most people feel that Florida's been a Republican-dominated state for years, but in fact, Republicans have never been a majority of the registrants of our state, and they're still not. About a 5% difference. But truly, the big story is that over 1/4 of Florida's voters now do not consider themselves or not registered as either a Democrat or Republican. They're mostly younger voters, under 50, but increasingly we see a lot of business professionals in our state abandoning a party registration and registering as no party affiliation for business purposes because politics in our state has become so toxic. So this is one of the things that we're starting to watch as social scientists. And then just a quick look here, women make up a larger share of the Democratic Party. Men are a little bit a larger group than women among Republicans more than Democrats among men. And by race and ethnicity, some really interesting things here. You notice that registrants in Florida, whites, are more Republicans. Hispanics are, I think, the big story here. Many people don't realize that it's a very mixed ethnic group, and again, a lot of the country of origin differences there. But you see that about a third of Hispanics don't register as any party, and that's very different from blacks who are overwhelmingly Democrats. And then you get a large contingency there is Florida's Asian population, which historically has registered more independents. So you get some very much big differences here that are explaining some of the micro-targeting that's going on in the ads. But of course, when you run for office statewide, you have to maneuver through 10 media markets, which is really interesting because most states only have 1 or 2. We have 10, which is why it costs so much money to run, and to keep an ad up for a week in Florida in 2012 was, I think, about $1.6 million. And so when people say, well, it costs so much, yes, it does because of these big media markets. But really, this is registration now. This is not viewers, but this is the political market piece here. When you look at the largest media market in Florida is actually the Tampa Bay area. 10 counties, 25% or so of the electorate is registered as living in that area. And right now, the last numbers we looked at, 37% Democrats, 37% Republicans, and the rest independents. It's the most divided, most competitive, largest market in the state. And if you add to that Orlando, you get the I-4 corridor that everybody talks about so much as being the swing part of the swing state. It is 44% of all registered voters live in the 2 media markets of Tampa plus Orlando. The most expensive media market is the Miami media market, the second largest. It is also the least competitive of the big markets because it leans much more heavily Democratic than the Orlando or Tampa markets. So one of the things that we do at USF with Nielsen, we are the issues survey. We've just taken over this poll from Leadership Florida. We're very happy, but a lot of people are not aware of it. But I thought I'd share a few slides with you today to show you, going into this election, what was the mindset of Floridians. And some of these slides are a little bit heavy, but I'll try to. So anyway, you see here that we've been polling. This poll has been going on since 2008. A lot of business leaders use it. We give a presentation to the legislature, and we're hopeful that groups like yours can spread the word because we have a website. It's free. You can use the data, talk about it, have discussion groups, etc. So the big question going into this election was what people thought was the biggest problem facing Florida. And again, no surprise, still dominant is the economy and jobs, because even though we've had some improvement in Florida's economy, the bottom line is that there's still an anxiety. People are still convinced that we're sort of in a recession or worried that we're going to slip back into it. So you have some concerns there, followed by education, which actually doubled since the last survey in terms of people picking that as the #1 issue, then followed by crime and immigration and the environment and taxes and so forth. But one of the things, since it is an election where there's so much attention to Florida's economy, one of the questions that was asked this year was what people thought was the best way for Florida to push its economic development. And the top one up there was basically the top 2 are traditional kinds of things, tax breaks to businesses that promised jobs and so forth, and then regulatory relief. But numbers 3 and 4 are really on the upswing, investing more in education and also improving the state's infrastructure. And these are both platform or ideas that have been pushed by a lot of business groups across the state. And we have a few interesting transportation votes around Florida on the ballot in some counties this fall. Another one is a traditional argument. Many of you local elected officials probably have encountered this one. Do you really, when you're trying to help people through a recession or whatever, is it better to really help existing businesses, or whether you should really kind of go out and help bring in new businesses? And you see here pretty much of a divide on that one. Now, my concern as an educator, and I know it's the business concern, and you saw it in that list of things that people think can be done to help our economy, is that we're turning out college and university grads today that are very, very different in the problems that they're experiencing than their predecessors. And certainly when we ask people what these college grads are experiencing, lack of well-paying jobs is number one, debt that these students have. Number 3 is graduating without job skills that businesses need today. Number 4, got cut off a little bit, employers worrying that young workers' work ethic is not as good as older workers, and so forth. And you see the concern about multilingual things. But to me, so far, one of the most troubling slides that we've seen in this year's Sunshine State Survey is the question about whether our education system overall in Florida, that would be K through 12 through PhD, higher ed, elementary, secondary, whether it's really preparing our students to compete in a global economy. And of course, you're one of the markets, when we broke out the results, that this is a big concern. You have a lot more international presence in business as well as people who have come here from other countries and whatever. But the key thing here is, look, almost a third of Floridians feel that we're not very successful at all in making our college grads competitive. And when you break it out, it's business people and it's college-educated people who are the ones who are really saying this at a much higher rate than others, ones who can actually see it. So this is something that I think leaders in our state from every sector have to be paying a little bit of attention to. Then, of course, we asked some other questions about things like gun control. And again, you can see there are a lot of issues that Floridians can sort of agree on, but there are some ones that, just like nationally, are just yielding a divide along ideological lines. And of course, current gun laws are one of those kinds of things. Then the environment, a huge issue in this governor's race. It will certainly, I think, be probed a lot more deeply at the upcoming debates than we've seen so far. But Florida is a state that people move to because of its environment, and Floridians have some pretty strong ideas about what the biggest problem is in our state, and it's water. Water overwhelmingly. And even if you took the top one there about water quality and quantity, and you looked at down the list there, you'd see things like protecting the springs and the coastlines eroding and all that. So about 40% of people's responses to what's the biggest environmental problem in our state is really water related. And you see it obviously a lot around here. But here is, to me, another really significant finding of our survey. And that is, when you ask people, you lay the premise that Florida is a divided state, it's more difficult to make decisions, come to consensus when you have divisions. What do you see as the biggest divide? And take a look. It's not religion, it's not gender, it's not race, it's all politics all the time at the top. And you'll see there the partisan divide, and also the second one, a disconnect between elected officials and the citizenry. And let me tell you, this response comes directly from what people think about Congress. And, but it is really interesting that people think it's the politics that's not helping our state more than it is these typical divides that we tend to focus on a lot. So, the question that's been asked beginning when Leadership Florida first started this poll years ago was, what do you want in your leader? Well, look at the top two there and think about the ads you see on television on the governor's race. I don't need to say any more than that, okay? And to continue here, when we ask, because again, we're looking at all three sectors. We're not just looking at politicians. But here again, you look at business versus government versus nonprofit leaders. And again, the short end of the stick in terms of the eyes of the public in Florida is that it's government leaders that aren't doing nearly as good a job, and actually business is doing a little bit better even than the nonprofits, which is not all that surprising when you've had a recession and people are focusing on businesses and job creation and so forth. So let's get down to the basics here of the governor's race. We're one of a handful of states that has a tied race right now, or a toss-up as they call it. This is from Real Clear Politics. So the gray, and no, that doesn't mean shady Florida, so we won't go there, okay? But anyway, it means that it's basically a tie. Going into this election, we as analysts sit down and we make kind of a checklist of things that we're going to be watching. So I made this list in December of last year. And these were the things that we put down, not just me, but others as well. Would the election be nationalized? Well, you know the answer to that. Everybody's watching Florida now, and not just the nation. We have a lot of international coverage of our governor's race. And at the beginning, we were wondering, well, would the Clintons and the Obamas come in here, or one or not the other? Well, you know the answer to that now. It's true, both of them are here campaigning in some fashion or another for Democrats. So you might ask yourself, well, what about the Republicans? Who can they bring in as celebrities? And, you know, sports stars and the golfer and so forth. But it's always the case that, you know, most of the time, ex-presidents coming in are very helpful. I didn't mention George W. Bush, but he too probably won't be here. But think of it. Why does Florida need to go outside for Republican stars? They've got the two on everybody's mind right now with Jeb Bush and Marco Rubio, because let's face it, this election, everybody's got one eye on 2014 and another one right on 2016. So interesting on that. We wondered if negative ads would tamp down turnout, and I'm going to come back to this again in a few minutes. And we also knew from the beginning we'd have a slew of constitutional amendments. After all, what do we have, 9 or 10 in 2012? Well, thank goodness we only have 3 this time, but they're always seen as a turnout driver in our state. It's nothing new that some people speculate that the amendment on medicinal marijuana was all about turnout of young voters. I mean, that's, you know, that's turnout is part of the game of petition-driven and legislative-driven constitutional amendments. Civil rights issues, huge national arguments about IDs, felon voting rights, all of that kind of thing. And, of course, the Trayvon Martin situation, and now, of course, with the situation in Missouri, civil rights we know will be a big part of the calculation of particularly African-American and other minorities in the state. And of course, debates have been influential, time eternal. Go back and look at, remember Jeb Bush's first debate with Lawton Childs and the he coon walks by the light of day, or whatever that little saying was. And then you had Bill McBride, who couldn't answer a Meet the Press Tim Russert question about education funding and so on. So we just have a history in our state of it, debates making a difference. How much money? The first estimate I saw on this election was $100 million. Now we're way beyond that. We're up to 200. So my question is, how much money does God have? And they're going to spend more than that if they can, so go figure. And then, of course, another one that we always wonder, this is one of the reasons I cannot call a race in Florida. You simply don't know, with the power of the media to create an issue overnight and keep it there. You don't know, between now and Election Day is a lifetime. I mean, think of it. 3 weeks ago, would you even been talking about Ebola, and now it's a dominant subject. So you don't know that something can come out of the debate or some other issue become preeminent that changes people's calculation, particularly those who don't vote early. Of course, absentee balloting is already underway pretty soon. So moving here, this election cycle we know to be a little bit different than in the past. Absolutely more money. But to me, one of the biggest stories is the outside money. And outside money doesn't mean outside of Florida. It means outside of the candidates and the political parties. Around 2/3 of the monies that were spent in that high-profile Congressional 13 race in that filled Bill Young's seat at the beginning of the year in Tampa between Oct.6 and David Jolly and a Libertarian. 2/3 of that money was from outside, and I moderated the second debate of the candidates, and I asked them, how much is this outside money causing you problems in controlling your own message, the tone of it, and the content? That's the one thing they emphatically agreed on. It was just making it almost impossible. They would have to go to groups of supporters and apologize for the ads that they had absolutely nothing to do with constructing them or running or paying for or anything else. We really see it's rampant in the governor's race. It's just that most average casual voters don't stop to look at that microscopic print in light font at the bottom of an ad, who's actually paying for it. But it's an outside money most of the time. We know we have less trust in these messages. One of the things that's really kind of interesting, sort of a law of unintended consequences, is all the fact-checking. It really has helped keep candidates' feet to the fire. But to the average person, when they rarely see one that's all true, they begin to get a little, well, they're all telling somewhat of a lie. So you get that kind of thing that's seeping into people's looking at that. And of course, competitive congressional and legislative races, where are they? You got 2 of the 3 congressional races of interest down here. The other one's in North Florida. I-4 has nothing, but we have very, very few competitive legislative seats too. So that means it's all about the governor's race and the amendments. So to remind you of this pattern that we're seeing now in Florida of just drip, 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 dropping, dropping, dropping down in terms of turnout. First, we know that turnout in gubernatorial races or midterm elections always plummets. That's a given. That's everywhere. It's been that way for a long time. But what people don't realize is what I mentioned a little earlier, and that is that turnout, even in presidential races, is dropping in Florida in spite of the fact that in 2012, Florida had more money spent on TV ads than the second most candidate visits of any candidate, any state, and we still had a drop. So who is it that stays home typically in a midterm election? Young voters, Hispanics, African Americans, and unmarried females. 3 critical bases that are absolutely important if a Democrat is to win a statewide race in Florida. That's why there's so much emphasis on micro-targeting and trying to figure out ways to reach these groups of voters. For Charlie Crist to win, he has to have almost presidential election year turnout of some of these groups, which historically drop a lot in a midterm election. So these ads are driving everybody crazy. You know, this guy's pretty much got ideas. If you tune in around any news cycle, especially in the I-4 corridor, but I'm sure it's here too, back-for-back ads that cancel each other out and are highly negative to the point of your average person trying to figure out who to vote for. After a while, you just throw up your hands and say, you know what, neither one of them is worth voting for, which is why each of their favorabilities are under 50% right now. So it makes it very challenging. How do you turn people's ear back to listen to an ad? Well, good luck, okay? So anyway, these are our 10 media markets. And it is true, and it's true again this time, that the I-4 corridor is critical, 44% of the registered voters. You can see how closely how the vote in that area predicts how Florida overall is going to vote, especially in presidential, less so in midterms. But here was just an analysis done by the Miami Herald recently. Some of you may have seen it, about where they're spending their money on ads. No surprise there, but there's only one market where Crist is actually outspending Scott, and that's in the Miami area. But you can just see the huge amount of money that's being expended. I think we're up over $80 million on ads already. We've still got a few weeks to go here. Of course, you know this too. Scott started spending a lot earlier than did Crist. This would be candidate spending, and some say that that's the reason that Charlie Crist's negatives have come down, were the effective early ads of Scott. But that's up for debate, but that is one of the premises that a lot of people think is true. So here we come to negative ads and turnout. I've already said we saw a drop in 2012, but look, we even saw a drop in the primary. And my point is, increasingly, it's looking like negative plus negative does not yield a positive in terms of energizing people to go vote. And it does call into question what the turnout is likely to be in this election. Just to give you a pretty picture here, an unpretty picture, or whatever you want to call it, but it shows the sharp divide in turnout in our state between the Panhandle counties and South Florida. This chart, more than anything else, explains where these candidates are going right now. Chris is having to spend a lot of time down here. We've hardly seen him in the I-4 corridor. He's come through a couple of times lately. He's got to get turnout here. This is the largest Democratic contingency of voters in South Florida right here. And Scott's been spending a lot of time in the Panhandle, the rural areas, and so forth. And if you think back and you know Florida history, it was Jeb Bush who wrote the formula: if you can't win in big urban areas and you're a Republican, or anybody for that matter, you go out to the Panhandle areas and you can make up some votes there because of the high turnout differential. So we're really watching this. Now, I, as a college professor, get absolutely anonymous things sent to my email, and this is one I could actually print and put up for you all to see. This was from a lady who anonymously sent this to me, I guess it was week before last, in the email. It shows to me the absolute frustration level that Floridians are experiencing with this governor's race right now. And, you know, back-to-back ads, canceling each other out. I loved it. Is there a place or where I can check which is true or more true, or maybe a little bit more true? You know. Very, very typical frustration that people are experiencing. So right now, these are how I see the issues that we're likely to see raised in the upcoming debates. I've categorized them and put some things underneath them that explain what we're likely to see. 3 debates coming up. First one is Friday. Of course, the economy, we saw it's still the dominant issue. Who's going to take the credit? Who's going to take the blame for the bad Florida economy and the recession and the recovery now? Then your usual taxes, spending, minimum wage. The role of government is big. It involves your idea about whether we should have taken money from the federal government or not. A lot of it comes down to role of government. Very partisan, big partisan divide on that front. And one of the things that's really surfacing in a lot of local races is the whole idea of Common Core. Even teachers are now starting to oppose it. The whole testing situation has just bubbled up now to where it's a huge issue in some local school board races and some legislative races that are competitive. And then you get fairness issues, gender, race, class, seen as big mobilizing issues for hard to turn out in a midterm election voters. And immigration reform, we've seen polls that show it's still an issue with Hispanic voters in this state, even though actually Scott is doing better among Hispanics than was the case for other recent Republican candidates. There is a rule of thumb in Florida that we sometimes use as analysts. If, knowing that Republicans have 5% fewer registrants than Democrats, there's a saying that if a Republican can split the women's vote and win a little bit more of the independent vote and do around 45% of Hispanics, that they can win a statewide race. And you've probably seen some things like that recently from the other side of it, Steve Shale, a Democrat, giving their formula, but it all comes down to the same kinds of groups that are being targeted. And of course, climate change. I didn't point out in that environmental slide that I showed you that only 3% of Floridians said that climate change was their big issue, and pollution was much bigger issues. But that doesn't stop Mr. Steyer from California for spending, I think now, what is it, $15 million? 12 or 15 he's put in. The Duke Energy ads, you're probably not seeing those down here like we are in Tampa, but they have definitely had some impact in terms of the polls. And then finally, kind of comes down to, again, what we started with, people's ideas of politicians and incumbents and how well people feel that their concerns are being taken care of by people running for office. We have 3 constitutional amendments. Number 1 is probably going to pass. Number 2 is probably going to fail. And number 3 is anybody's guess, but I can guarantee you there's not an editorial board in Florida that's going to go for that one. So I'll just leave it at that. Why am I saying the medicinal marijuana? The numbers have been slipping. The last 5 polls I've looked at have all been under 60%. And the anti-group has spent a lot. Both of them are on television now. But here is something very interesting. Initially, everybody, and I guarantee most of you in here, really thought, well, young voters, let's put that on the ballot. We'll get a turnout. It'll be an edge to Democrats. Charlie Crist will be elected governor. That was a good premise until the other side started spending money too. So now I am seeing it more of an equal turnout motivator for both sides on this issue. But it could still pass because, let's face it, what was the big surprise in 2012 that not a person in this room nor I really ever got a handle on? And that was the fact at the last minute, voter turnout among 18 to 29-year-olds was actually up in Florida. So that, I guarantee you, if you walk on any college campus, maybe not Palm Beach Atlantic, but you may see, by the way, my neighbor's children went there and they loved it. So, but normally, you know, you just have to assume that there'll be that push. And we at USF are the only university that has this campus-wide straw poll. It's tomorrow, and we will see how this issue is playing out and so forth. So here's our 3 debates. First one is this Friday. Next week is the one sponsored by Leadership Florida and the Florida Press Association at Broward College. And the third one is CNN in Jacksonville. So far, the Libertarian has not been included. They set the threshold at 15%. He has to reach 15% in the poll to be included. He says that's unfair. He's hired a lawyer. We don't know. But my point is that we're losing younger people in media, and if there's a third person comes into debate that draws them to be interested, then I think it's really very, from a business perspective, shallow for news people not to want to have third-party people in debate. After all, the old argument, you can only have 2 people on the stage. Think of it. Last presidential, we had 10 on the stage. Had record people tuning in, so I don't buy that argument. That's my only editorial comment you're going to hear me say today, but I really like to see inclusion in debates, not exclusion. So here's the end here. This is what it is right now. This is the poll, the tracking polls, they call them. It's a moving average concept. This is the Huffington Post. Hardly would anybody say that this is a bastion of conservatism. It's not. But yet you see this poll was as of, we pulled it October the 2nd, and you see there Scott up by 1 point something. But the real telltale is the probability that Scott would win, 50.9. Flip a coin. That's where we're at. So if you like Scott, this is a good one for you. But if you don't, just look at this one, Real Clear Politics, which came 2 days after, and here's a different result. This one has Crist up by a couple of percentage points. And then there was another one released this morning that has Scott up by 3. All of you who had statistics and should have been paying attention to it when you're in college, you know that this is basically a tied race within margin of error. It can go either way. After all, those 2 slides I showed you at the beginning, dead heats on the last 2 big elections we've had. So anyway, this was a comment that was made earlier this year when Crist was down in the polls. But I think, forget who said it, but it's pretty much where it's at. It is absolutely coming down to get out the vote. It really is trite, but we know if people don't vote and somebody else does, their candidate or their voter supporters, they're going to win. So it's all about get out the vote. So what do we have left? The debates, the constitutional amendment, the tone of the ads, the type of contact. I don't ever advise any candidates, not that I advise candidates, I don't see the sense in robocalls right now because I honestly think they're inversely hurting people who use them. Let me just see a show of hands. Well, maybe you don't want to do it with friends near you, but you know, how many of you like robocalls? I didn't think so. Okay. And then, of course, the old style versus substance. You can pick which one of these you think has style or substance. I don't know. But anyway, The age-old question in politics is, do people vote on a personality, somebody they like, the old question about who do you want to have a beer with, or do they vote on issues? We have about 10% of electorate that's strictly, single-issue voters, not a whole lot, but, so we don't know what that's going to look like either. But this I'm absolutely sure of. We are once again the swingin'est state in the country. And once again, I am very happy to say, thank God I'm not a political scientist in North Dakota, because it would be terribly boring. Thank you. Thank you.